All right, well, I haven't heard anybody pop in for a little bit, so there's no objections. I'll go ahead and we can get started with this presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming and listening to our presentation on a summary of 2 Historic Preservation Fund grants that we are in the process of wrapping up today. So we'll have a presentation on a project in Summit Lake State Park, which is in, well, they're both in Henry County, in northern Henry County, and the Wilbur Wright Fish and Wildlife area. This is, I wanted to take some time to do a little plug about AAL and what we are. So for those of you who don't know, the Applied Anthropology Laboratories is an institute at Ball State University, and our mission is basically to provide hands-on experience for students doing the kinds of work that they will be doing hopefully when they graduate and go out into the quote-unquote real world. And so our motto is learn, work, discover, because that's what we hope that all of our students get to do. We do that by working on contract projects, cultural resource management for development projects, but then also grant projects like this. And the students are involved in every stage of those projects, from doing the field work to doing the lab analysis and to helping us write the reports. And so that is the context of what we're doing. We also emphasize, when we can, community engaged projects. So we try to identify community partners with a need that we can help out with. So this is an example of that kind of a project as well. And so we also have T-shirts. That's nice. But anyway, I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Kevin Nolan, and I am the director of the Applied Anthropology Laboratories. And I get to work with a lot of really cool people, including the ones that you're going to learn about today. And the people who worked on this project really need to thank Aaron Powers, who is on here, for taking the lead on a lot of pulling all of this stuff together, and the graduate assistants, Jamie Godfrey and Sidney Travis, for helping us to get to this point and finishing up the reports and all of the analysis and managing all of the data that's generated. And Chris Thompson, who is not on this call right now, is working frantically to finish up some of our deliverables for these projects. And Sean Coughlin, who I believe is on here, also helped out with field work and with the lab analysis. And of course, we couldn't do most of the stuff that we do without Caroline Heston helping to keep us all organized and get all the logistics arranged. Without that, we wouldn't actually get out into the field. So with that, I will turn it over to Sidney Travis, who was the graduate assistant for the Wilbur Wright version of this presentation. So go ahead, Sidney.
Hello, I am Sidney Travis, and as Kevin just said, I worked on the Wilbur Wright portion of this presentation. This project was partially funded by the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology to aid us in identifying, analyzing, and preserving historic properties and cultural resources in Indiana. And as a disclaimer, site locations are confidential in Indiana to protect archaeological resources. Thus, sites will be discussed, but no images of these sites will be represented in this presentation. Okay. Next slide, Kevin. For a quick overview of the Indiana archaeology laws, it is not illegal to surface collect artifacts unless it is on private property without the landowner's permission, or if it is on state or federal land. But it is legal if it's on your own land to protect. It is also illegal to dig with the intention of finding artifacts, no matter if it's on your private property, without state approval without a state-approved plan by a qualified professional archaeologist. If you do happen to locate an archaeological site, report your findings to the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, or the DHPA, to ensure that the site's landowners and Native American cultures are protected. Grant, a series of tasks and deliverables are provided for the DHPA and to the public, and that begins from June 1st, 2019 to June 30th, 2020. We first conduct a field survey, then a technical report is submitted to the DHPA. Following that, an article is published in an open access journal, the Indiana Archaeology Journal, that is accessible to the public and anyone online. To the right is an image of some of those articles published there. Additionally, all the sites are entered into SHARD, which stands for the State Historic Architectural and Archaeological Research Database, which includes all the sites located throughout Indiana. And finally, a presentation, which is what we're doing right now on the project, is given before the end of the grant timeline. The grant efforts are pretty much the same for Summit Lake State Park and Wilbur Wright Fish and Wildlife Area. Both received $50,000 from the Historical Preservation Fund grant, and it was matched 30% by Ball State. Each had 3,100 staff and student hours. They both had between 20 and 30 trips. There was 20 trips to Wilbur Wright between July and August of last year. And then there was about 25 trips to Summit Lake between August and September. Summit Lake also had funding to do ground penetrating radar survey, which will be described a little later in more detail by Kevin, in October. And all of the deliverables for these projects are due today. Woohoo!
I'm not doing anything else today, just.
So before we begin talking a little bit more about archaeology in Indiana, we have some terminology that is important to discuss. So an artifact is any portable object made or used by humans that can be indigenous pre-contact or historic. And we collect anything that could be over 50 years old. A lithic is an artifact made of stone, and that stone is usually chert, or otherwise known as flint, which is sedimentary rock that was used to make a pre-contact tool. A diagnostic artifact is an artifact that can be dated with some sort of degree, and a feature are the remains of non-portable human activity. So on the images, on the right, that big stone structure is part of a feature. We have a core fragment, which is a lithic, and then we have a diagnostic piece of historic pottery. Yeah, that's what I'm going to use there. Okay. To continue on with some certain terms, we also have special notations for our sites following the Smithsonian trinomial nomenclature. A site is a location where artifacts are found, and to differentiate between these sites, each is given a unique name using a nationwide numbering system that you can see below. So the 12 stands for Indiana State. Each state is numbered alphabetically. Indiana's the 12th. HN refers to the county. For this one, it's Henry County. And 465 states the number of the site. So to read this accordingly, site 465 found in Henry County, Indiana is the 465th site located. Archaeological sites are dated and referred to different cultural time periods. These are separated into two blocks. We have pre-contact time periods and post-contact time periods. The pre-contact periods include the Paleo-Indian period, which is represented by the first lithic in that photo, from 10,000 to 7,500 BC. the Archaic period, which is the second and third lithics in the image, from 8,000 BC to 750 BC. The Woodland period, which is the fourth lithic, goes from around 1000 BC to 1200 AD. And the last period is the late prehistoric / Mississippian period from about 1080 to 1650 AD, which is the last lithic in that image. The post-contact block has the protohistoric period, characterized by indirect contact with Europeans via their artifacts found in deposits, and the European period, which is direct contact with Europeans up until present time. Okay. So this slide shows the different chert resources found in Indiana to make lithics and projectile points. As you can see, the glacial limits are also mapped to show how the glaciers buried bedrock, housing the chert resources in the northern 2/3 of Indiana, but not in the southern third because the bedrock was exposed because the glaciers didn't move up that far. So as you can see, that is there. And then to the right, we have some lithics found this year that are indicative of these different types of chert. So the grant team included all of the AAL staff and archaeologists. So Kevin already mentioned them earlier. We have Sean Coughlin, Aaron Powers, Chris Thompson, Kevin himself, and Caroline Heston. We have graduate assistants working on these projects, including me, Jamie Godfrey, and Catherine Holland, who worked on the Summit Lake project in the first half of the school year. We had over 18 student workers working on various parts of this project. Our final analysis was performed by biological anthropologist Dr. S. Holmes Hogue. And of course, we couldn't have done it without the DHPA staff, the Wilbur Wright staff, and the Summit Lake staff. Okay, so there are two types of phase 1 survey in Indiana. Well, I guess nationwide. We have PET surveys, which are conducted when the ground surface is visible, and we have shovel testing, which occurs when the ground surface is not visible. For pedestrian surveys, they include walking 10 meters apart or 33 feet, and they mark artifacts with flags whenever they find one, whereas a shovel test is done 15 meters apart or 50 feet, where there are positive and negative shovel tests. Once all of the shovel tests in the survey area are completed, the AAL archaeologist will decide what the site boundaries are, and then any positive shovel tests located on the edges of these site boundaries are then delineated in the cardinal directions by 5 meters in order to refine the boundaries of these different sites. After the survey is completed, all of the artifacts are then taken to the lab where they are washed, relabeled to preserve the context of the artifact, identified, cataloged, and mapped to coincide with the deliverables necessary for the DHPA and to the public. As you can see in these images, we have some individuals looking at shovel test forms in the bottom right. We have Brooke Kurtai, who worked on the Summit Lake project on the top right, and she's looking at some artifacts that you'll see images of later. And then, you know, a beautiful picture of our somewhat clean looking lab, which doesn't always look like that. And now that the background for Indiana archaeology is completed and what we do in the AAL during these surveys, let's get into the results of these different projects. So take it away, Kevin.
Okay, so I will be talking about the Summit Lake project. Summit Lake State Park is around the reservoir that constitutes Summit Lake currently. The park is around 2,690 acres. The reservoir opened in 1985 by the Big Blue River Conservancy District. And then in '88, the Conservancy District sold it to the state and it became a state park. Then in 1991, Ziegler Woods Nature Preserve was added to that, expanding it by 120 acres. And before our survey, there were 8 previously recorded archaeological sites within the park. There are now a few more. So our goals for this project, a couple of years ago, there was a project that undertook a literature survey to document all of the known mounds and earthworks in the state of Indiana. That was the Preserve America Mounds Inventory project, or PAMIP there. There were 2 mounds that were reported within Summit Lake State Park that had never been field verified by archaeologists. And so that was our primary goal, and it structured the rest of our project. And so we were going to go out and look, see if we could identify those mounds. And we also set out a 30-acre area, survey area around each of those within the park to try to see if the mound was there, what is the context of that, what other sites are going on around that earth and architecture. Then, based on the results of what we find, try to refine the cultural chronology, the history of what we know it happened in the county. Then also we would increase the number of shard sites, officially recorded sites in the state database that Sidney mentioned earlier. And then if we identify in our research any inconsistencies in the database with reported locations of sites, try to resolve those. And then once we did look for those 2 mounds, when we identified some places that looked like they could have been mounds, we did a ground penetrating radar survey of those to see if they were indeed mounds. So here's a general location of where we're talking about, the 2 mounds that were reported that we were trying to verify. And so we went in and we did our survey of about 60 acres. We found several pre-contact artifacts. Most of them were non-diagnostic, so we can't tell when they were made. And that included some cores. We got a core there, some flakes and shatter, otherwise debitage debris of the process of making stone tools. And then, not pictured here, some fire-cracked rock and unifacial and bifacial tool fragments. And we did find some just 2 diagnostic artifacts, pre-contact artifacts. The first one is a triangular projectile point, and so this would have been an arrow point, and this is actually one of the few types of projectile points, bifaces, that we find that are actually more likely arrowheads. They're very, very tiny, very, very thin triangles that would have fit on the end of an arrow shaft. And this one dates to the late woodland period, sometime after 800 AD, up until possibly the contact period. And then we have this one over here, which is substantially older, is a Middle Archaic side-notched point dating to about 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. Then we have some historic artifacts, some non-diagnostic historic artifacts include bricks, various rubber objects, plastic, undecorated ceramics, a variety of different kinds of glass. And you can see we've got some amber glass here, some milk glass here that is actually a little bit more diagnostic. Some just plain whiteware sherds that are not too terribly diagnostic. Some of these actually in this picture are diagnostic, and we'll talk about some of those later. Then the more diagnostic historic artifacts have unique things about the manufacturing, or possibly sometimes labels, stamps from maker's marks, certain styles that were only made for a limited period of time. And so here we have an example of a glass bottle that was made from 1919 to 1929. And then we have some depression glass, bowl rim, and a ceramic insulator. All of those with relatively circumscribed manufacturing dates. So we, in addition to the survey, we were also able to look at some historic maps. And what you see here is, I'm not sure if it's all that visible for everybody, but the green and blue lines that you see on here, those are features that we discovered. So intact structure parts in most cases that we found that represent historic period occupations, homes, garages, farm outbuildings, and showing how they line up with some of the historic maps that we have for the area. Okay, so I'm going to review a couple of the more interesting sites that we found. Most of the stuff that we found in this project in Summit Lake State Park were historic artifacts and historic features. And we had historic features at 5 different sites out of 31 total sites. And so in this one, site 12HN 463, we had this historic stone line, a possible remnant of a foundation associated with a water pump that we found. And this aligns with something that was recorded as the Duke property in the 1875 atlas, and there was a structure pretty much overlaying right where this possible stone foundation remnant and water pump were located. We also found additional structural remnants, 24 brick fragments, several pieces of glass and ceramic, and an unidentified metal piece. And so you might recognize these artifacts here. And so we did find some just plain whiteware again, but we found a canning jar, milk glass lid that dates from after the 1890s into the 20th century. We found a Bristol glazed stoneware ceramic sherd that dates again from about 1890 to the 20th into the 20th century. A redware lead glazed ceramic sherd here. It dates into the 19th century, and a hand painted whiteware sherd over there, which dates from between 1830 and 1890. And so what you might have noticed is all of those are 19th century, predominantly 19th century dates, and so that's very consistent with what we saw on the historic maps. And so we have a direct connection probably here to the people mapped on that historic atlas. We also have site 471, which also had features, and this one had a concrete foundation, a driveway, a demolished structure with a remnant depression left over from that foundation, concrete slab, a walkway, and then various building materials strewn all over the site. And this was our largest concentration of historic features in the survey, and very, very densely dense cluster of historic architecture. Also had some stoneware, some clear glass, and some miscellaneous artifacts. There are structures that show up in the 1969 aerial photography, and also that show up in the 1985 plat map associated with the Big Blue River Conservation District. And several of the artifacts also date from the middle of the 20th century, although we also have some possible alignment with some of the 19th century structures that are mapped on the 1875 and 1893 atlas. And so this particular site was a multi-component site within the historic period that was reused at least by 2 different types of entities. Another site that has a lot of structures and is actually very near those other 2 sites, 12HN 473 also had a long list of features, same kinds of things as we had in 471, and lots of glass, lots of ceramic pieces, metal. Most of the artifacts from 473, similar to 463, the first site that I talked about, date to the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, including we found one cut nail that was manufactured most likely before 1820. And so possibly a very early structural occupation in this vicinity. And this lines up with the Snyder properties that are shown on the 1875 and 1893 maps. An interesting thing that we found, and I should have thrown a picture of it in here, was we found a miniature checkers piece. And so we have, in addition to the evidence of the dishes and the structures and how those were made, we do have some signs of leisure and play and children being present on the property. So here are some of the diagnostic artifacts from site HN 473. The bottle dates to as early as 1890, and was dated primarily using the finish, the top where the cap would go on of the bottle. We also have some depression glass, a depression glass plate, which is manufactured from the 1890s to the 1920s. The light blue glass was manufactured in the 19-teens to 1920s. And then this is, anybody recognize that? Raise your hand. Oh, wait, I can't see you. This is a ball jar, a fragment of a ball jar. And so you can see up here the ball script, and it's a standard Mason stamped right across the middle of this shirt here. And so this particular variety would have been manufactured sometime between 1930s into the 1960s. And then we found these, which look very weird, and they're very large. These are animal traps that were manufactured likely between the 1880s and 1920s. And so that's not something you find every day, and hopefully when you do find them out in the field, they're in non-working order, so that nobody gets hurt. But I thought was a pretty cool find that I've never actually seen before. So then we have site HN 480, which this is just an isolated stone that we found in one of, oddly, coincidentally, in one of our shovel test pits. And so you're going to dig a hole that's about that big, and you find a stone that's bigger than the hole inside of that by chance. And this has some evidence on the edges on both sides of having been cut and shaped. And so it's a cut stone, likely for some kind of architecture, but it's isolated. It's out there in the middle of this field all by itself. And so there were no artifacts associated with it. And it's a peculiar little feature that wandered its way into the middle of an agricultural field. And at site 12 HN 489, we also have some more foundations, concrete pads, and these two are right next to what was historically a long-term farm, the Harvey farmstead, that shows up as early as the 1870s and through the 1900s. Didn't find very much in the way of artifacts, historic artifacts at least, associated with this site, but this site is actually associated with a very large spread of pre-contact stone artifacts. All right, so back to the maps, and we can see down here we have the Duke property and then the Snyder property wrapping around here. And you can see how those features are lining up pretty well with these fairly coarse scale maps that we forced into our GIS for the project. and then as we move into 1985, there are some structures in the same place, but now we have this middle structure where there wasn't one before, and this is lining up with the artifacts that we're seeing. So up here we had 19th and 20th century artifacts, 19th century artifacts down here, but pretty much only 20th century artifacts at this middle site, and that is adding some detail to those historic maps. And here is on the right is where we're seeing those last two stone pads that we were talking about, right next to this 19th century, late 19th century structure that was mapped in one of the atlases. Okay, so now back to the reason that we went out there to find all of those historic features was the pre-contact mounds that were reported. And there was site 12HN17 and 12HN74 were the reported mounds. And so here's the topography of those two survey areas. And we do have some discrepancies as to where the sites were located. The maps that were originally submitted for this one put it in multiple different places. One has a huge thing that encompasses like 9 acres across 2 different terrace remnants. And then there's also another report of the site that puts it down on this slope edge. And then there's another one that has it way over here. So it was difficult to figure out where to expect the mound to be. The only things that we found in the field that looked like they could be mounds are down here on the lower elevations on the floodplain. And you can see then there are these green dots in the middle of these light, I guess that's a light blue contour lines down here. And so we conducted GPR survey of both of those, and this one we called grid 1, this one we called grid 2. Then in our other survey area looking for site HN17, it was mapped up in this area. Most of the area that was originally mapped is mostly on these relatively steep slopes, but we couldn't find anything over there that looked like a mound. There was one small area over here on the eastern edge that did look like a possible mound, and so that we designated grid 3. So some real basic introduction to radar, sending radio waves into the ground. We use this cart. The antenna is actually down here in the bottom, and it just transmits waves into the ground and waits and counts nanoseconds until they come back. And so this over here is an illustration of what the radar sees. It's very, very quiet, and then when it hits something that's different, the wave goes all kinds of crazy and gets really, really big. And the direction that the wave goes tells us something about the material. If it goes to the right in this image, it's slowing down. It's having more trouble getting through that material. If it goes to the left, it's speeding up, and so it's easier to get through that material. And so based on that, the ability of the wave to penetrate through the material, that tells us about the material, and so we can kind of get some idea of what is going on there. So it's the phase or the direction of the shift in that wave that tells us about the material. So the first one, grid 1, looking for HN74, we see, I'm going to do some drawing here. And some of the slices in this is fairly consistent throughout most of them. And so this is a horizontal plan view map of the composite of the survey. And so you can see this area through here where there is a break, and it's consistent across all of the lines that we walked with the radar that circumscribes the edge of the rise. And so that's a consistent alteration to the normal soil development. And you can even see it in this other image as well. And you can see, and even in the very shallow, you're starting to get some things that indicate that there might be something within that is different in character than what's outside of the mound. And so the mound that we surveyed is to the bottom end of this of the images on the map. And so there's beginnings of a surface coming up over here, and then there's a bunch of different surfaces that are also showing up there. And so this is what the some examples of what the profiles look like. And so this is what the radar does. So the radar goes along the surface here and sends down the waves going down here, and you can see the different colors and intensities of the colors is telling us something about the material. Can I clear off that? There. And so you can see in each of these, there's a version of the same thing that gets more and more complicated as you go across. And there's actually multiple layers going on in this in these images. And so you're just getting different kinds of layers with different properties stacked on top of each other inside of this rise. So going through all of those profiles that we surveyed, we mapped out every single thing that we could see that was reflecting in there. And so you get this ginormous mess that's over here. And sifting through that, we break it down into things that are just representing those continuous layers that are surfaces. And we see very quickly that inside the rise, there is a bunch of overlapping features. And in this map, the tighter the lines filling the layer are, the deeper it is in the ground. And so you only have very, very shallow surfaces outside of the mound, and then you have these deeper overlapping things. And the green ones are negative phase, or it's easier for the wave to get through. And so you've got those different properties overlapping each other, where there's resistant materials, then non-resistant materials, resistant, non-resistant. And so that is fairly consistent with what you see in a lot of mound sites that are woodland period mound sites, where they do layer clay over silt or clay over sand, and those are the kinds of differences that we're probably looking at here, is different the ability of different layers to hold on to water. So, oops, I should go back to that. And so our interpretation of this is that the rise in grid 1 is probably a pre-contact period mound with a complex accretional formation history. Then grid 2, also looking in the area of HN74, due to really, really dense vegetation, we couldn't get a lot of this rise surveyed. But the main thing that we see in this are these rectangular arrangements of linear features. And you can even see some lines connecting on the inside here. This is two different views of the same thing, just trying to get it to emphasize the strongly reflective layers. And so this looks an awful lot like a modern structure in outline. And we can see that if we're looking at the profiles, this looks a lot different than the profiles that we saw for grid 1. You've got flat surfaces, you've got these things here that are making those lines. This is what those lines going across the previous slide looked like in the profiles. And so this one also had a lot more going on in it. And so doing the same messy interpretation, this is all of the surfaces that in that layer, and they're just all over the place, and it's very busy. So summary interpretation is taking just the that are, I don't know how well you can see this, but these yellow crosses here, these are continuous lineal features. And so it traces out this rectangular structure here with interior walls. And so it probably is a historic period structure underneath at least this part of that rise. And so not a pre-contact mound. Then the last one, grid 3, looking for HN17. Again, we have the really complicated all of the interpretations that we could make out of the profile. And you also see something where you have these linear features coming in and rectangular arrangements. And so this one is also a very likely a historic structure, also with a concrete, probably concrete foundation. This one, we were able to get a little bit more detail in what we could do with looking at the depths of things. And so this doesn't really come out very well, but you can see if you see these little purple and pink dots, these are where the features being interpreted that show up in the map over to the right are. And so you've got these flat rectangular surfaces, and then there's a gap in there, and then another gap in between there. And so we get these linear gaps going through that are crossed over by these linear features, making rectangular arrangements. And so this is also probably a historic period structure underneath that rise, and so not the mound we were looking for. So in summary, we were unable to successfully confirm the locations of either of the reported mounds, because while this one is a possible mound, the original reported locations are up here. And so we can't say for sure that what we found is what that was originally reported, and the other two areas are not mounds, or not pre-contact mounds. So I believe that is, no, one more slide. In summary, we found 31 new archaeological sites. We attempted at least to reinvestigate 2 previously reported sites, the 2 mound sites, surveyed just shy of 62 acres, and recovered 203 pre-contact artifacts, 126 historic artifacts. It's not listed on here, but we also found 18 features, 17 of which are historic. The one is the pre-contact mound. A variety of different site types, and a couple of different time periods, and identified prehistoric for most of the pre-contact stuff, and then various historic periods. And so now we will turn it over to Sidney.
Hello again. So I'm going to talk about the Wilbur Wright findings. Here's an image of Wilbur Wright. It encompasses 1,070 acres of land. And I have a picture that I took of our survey area, at least for half of the survey area, of me standing in a whole bunch of plants that go over my head. It was not great, but beautiful. And I had to show that to people. So a little bit of history of Wilbur Wright. We have historic and pre-contact history that are both very important. For the historic context, the area was previously known as housing the Indiana Village for Epileptics from 1905 to 1920. It was later known as the Newcastle State Hospital. The name changed again to the Wilbur Wright Recreation Area in 1972. And finally, we get to what it is now called as the Wilbur Wright Fish and Wildlife Area. So as I said, there's a long history of both historic and pre-contact occupation in Wilbur Wright. So I have an image here of the woodland period pre-contact occupation sites of all of Henry County and of Wilbur Wright, because we focus on the woodland period during this survey, since this is our second year of this survey. This map includes the famous earthworks of the Newcastle site and the multi-occupation site of the Van Nuys site. And one of the sites located last year during our survey has a woodland period component to it, which, you know, helped us with our research this year. So the goals of this grant are aimed to aid the Division of Fish and Wildlife in interpreting and managing archaeological sites. We hope to refine the cultural chronology of Henry County. one of our big goals was to refine the boundaries of Site 458, located last year during our survey. We also want to increase the number of sites in Shard and resolve any inconsistencies we find or found. So our project survey area was 65.95 acres of land that were adjacent to Site 12H and 458. And as you can see, the plants weren't always over our heads, but they were always very thick, so we only did shovel testing survey during this project. So in the survey area, there was 1,021 STPs, or shovel test probes, excavated. 99 of them were positive. And in total, we had 183 artifacts, with only 3 of them being historic, the rest being pre-contact, and then 1 final artifact. There were no features encountered, but in total, we located 4 new archaeological sites and extended the boundaries of Site 458. Our site types included lithic scatters, a historic scatter, and prehistoric isolates. So just to quickly review what we found last year at Site 458, as I said, it was surveyed in 2018. There was 159 shovel tests excavated, 50 were positive. They found many more artifacts, including 7 diagnostic grit tempered ceramic sherds that are possibly from the earlier middle woodland period. However, we just called the site woodland period just because we don't have much information on it. The rest were non-diagnostic artifacts, including biface fragments, core fragments, flake, shatter, groundstone tools, and fire-cracked rock. During our reinvestigation this year, we found no additional diagnostic artifacts, but the site expanded from approximately 4 to 6 acres to 34 acres total, with 177 pre-contact artifacts, which was 96.7% of all of the artifacts found during our survey this year. They're both historic and prehistoric components, and the image is of a core fragment found in this site this year. As I said before, there's no diagnostic artifacts, but we did find core fragments, flakes, shatter, and fire-cracked rock. And in the image that follows, in this next slide, the top photo is of shatter, and the bottom is some examples of flakes of various chert outcrops. So we found 1 faunal remained that was identified by Dr. S. Holmes Hogue. It was of white-tailed deer fawn dentition, very, very small, very tiny. And our 3 non-diagnostic historic artifacts, we have a metal wire, a piece of ironstone, and a piece of whiteware with some blue coloration, but the piece was so small we couldn't do any additional diagnostic analyses on it. So in summary, we found 4 new archaeological sites. We expanded the boundaries of 1 site during a reinvestigation. We surveyed about 65.95 acres, found 180 pre-contact artifacts, 3 historic artifacts, and then the 1 faunal artifact. Our site types included lithic scatters of the large site, the historic scatter of the large site, a couple small lithic scatters in 2 of the new sites, and 2 isolated finds. And they were all deemed as unidentified prehistoric and historic periods because none of the artifacts were diagnostic. But because this survey was a part of a 2-year grant in the same general area, there were additional analyses and research conducted on the prehistory of Wilbur Wright that Kevin worked a lot on in the past few days.
As Sidney noted, there were a lot of woodland period sites in the general area of the Wilbur Wright Fish and Wildlife area, including some very famous earthworks. And before we started already, 1 really large habitation site, the Van Nuys site, 12HN25, which has a large late woodland component, so around 500 to 1000 AD, and possibly after 1000 AD. But it's also got, it's a stratified site, and so there are some earlier components that are deeper, and it's on a lowland area, and next to one of the local streams, and so it does have some flood accumulation that's burying those earlier deposits. And so there's been a lot of discussion about what the settlement patterns are. Where do people tend to locate their houses, their villages over time in East Central Indiana? And some of the initial discussions of that talked about a change in location from the early woodland period to the late woodland period, whereas the earlier sites are up on the would be located on these bluffs, the terrace edges, in the uplands, and then as agriculture becomes more prevalent in the late woodland, they would move down into the lowlands, into the valleys, and so there's this apparent change within the woodland period in where sites are located. The problem is that there aren't a lot of early and middle woodland period habitation sites that have been found, and this problem kind of pervades middle woodland Hopewell research throughout the Midwest. That the middle woodland sites are pretty hard to find unless they're earthworks. And so in 1996, Beth McCord and Don Cochran came up with the idea that maybe they aren't that different from the late woodland sites. Maybe they are in the same places, but being older on the floodplains, they're buried and we can't find them just by walking the surface and digging shallow shovel tests in those valleys. And so this data set, the new sites that we found and looking at these previously recorded sites, gives us an opportunity to look at that and see whether the earlier models and descriptions of the settlement patterns were correct, or if McCord and Cochran's interpretation or prediction is correct. One of the things that they do use is that Beth used in a later paper is the Van Nuys site, HN25, to say, look, we have these a middle woodland and early woodland probable habitation sites that are buried below this surface late woodland site, and that's showing that yes, these do get buried. Well, our site 12HN 485 is also located in a lowland area. It was not a floodplain for the river that runs through there. It's in a glacial valley, but it has the same types of environment that you would be looking for in a valley floodplain. It was right next to a prairie, which is also what HN25 is recorded as being next to a prairie. And so it's a very similar setting. And if sure enough, we do have this woodland period occupation, probably an early or middle woodland occupation on this this lowland area, but because it's in a glacial valley and not in a narrowly carved river valley. Now there is a river that runs through it, but it's not carved by that river, so it doesn't get flooded up on that landform as much. So there's less opportunity to bury the site. But both of these sites, the one we discovered, 458 and 25, are over 30 acres in size. They're very large, diffuse woodland period sites, so very similar, and they're very close to each other. They're within 600 meters of each other, or within a mile. And so if we look at the elevations of the sites and the locations, which ones are on lowlands and which ones are on uplands, we can see that so the late woodland is our reference point. We've got about 57% of the sites are on the lowlands, and so yes, that does seem to indicate that they're more prevalent there. But the average elevations for the early woodland is not much different than the late woodland. And a lot of these, the upland sites that we see that are late woodland and early woodland are not habitation sites. There are almost no home sites, villages up in the uplands. When they do get identified as that, they are on the lowlands. And so we seem to have this separation in site function. We have the earthworks and the non-habitation sites, the hunting sites up in the uplands during the early and middle woodland, but during the early, middle, and late woodland, they all seem to be living in the floodplains, and very likely we do see what McCord and Cochran expected, that we aren't seeing the early and middle woodland sites because they're buried under the flood deposits, and sometimes even underneath the later late woodland sites. And so that's just a brief overview of what we looked at with these different site locations and settlement patterns. But you're probably tired of me talking now, so we'll go to our acknowledgement slide and thank everybody who helped us out. And we're indebted to the Indiana Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology staff, Rachel and Malia that are on here. Beth McCord, who we were just talking about, is the director there, and everybody there. We couldn't do these projects without them. Also, I feel weird thanking myself as a staff member of the Applied Anthropology departments, but for the rest of the staff and all of our students, can't do these projects without field crews, so we need them. We also get a lot of support from our sponsor projects administrations at Ball State and Chad Paskowitz and Stephanie Roof and Augusta Ray really give us a lot of help getting these grants submitted and managing the accounting for those. And we're very grateful for our partners at the two properties, the Wilbur Wright Wildlife Area and Summit Lake State Park, and grateful for the support of the Henry County Historical Society. And so I think that is everyone I needed. If I forgot you and I was supposed to mention it, I'm sorry. So do we have any questions?
I've muted everyone's microphones, so if you do have something to say, go ahead and unmute your microphone. You can either click on the bottom, it should pop up for you, or wherever your mute button is on your computer should work as well.
So to Summit Lake project, did you have expectation of like pre-contact versus contact era sites that you would see? It seemed like there was a lot of, early 19th century features and stuff. Was that kind of a surprise? Were there fewer pre-contact sites than you expected?
Aaron, do you want to take that
one? Yeah, so because I came in part of the way through after the proposal was submitted for Summit Lake, I really didn't know what to expect, but obviously I was expecting a lot of pre-contact artifacts and features just because we were focusing in on finding the two previously investigated sites, 12 each in 17 and 74. So I think we were expecting to find more indication of woodland period activity than we were historic. But then once we were out doing the field survey, it was really clear that there was a lot of historic occupation, especially on the east side of Summit Lake. And we even went in and extended the survey area 1 boundary just so we could continue to find out the extent of this little historic concentration where there's tons of features that Kevin was talking about in site 471 and 473 and in 463. So yeah, there's a lot that we didn't expect historically speaking. So it was a lot more interesting than I thought it would be, and a lot more like cultural occupation that I wasn't expecting for sure.
Yeah, I was surprised, especially by, as she said, on the east side. There's 3 or 4 house lots that are just boom, 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 right on top of each other, and that's not what I expect when I'm going out to do survey in a relatively rural part of East Central Indiana. So it was kind of interesting and surprising, interesting even for me, who's more obsessed with the pre-contact aspect of archaeology. Any other questions?
So the original reports of mounds, where did those come from? So what exactly like documentation was utilized as like the foundation for believing that there were mounds in those 2 areas?
I guess Erin's going to defer to me to answer that one.
Oh no, I can answer it. Okay. I was waiting for you. Okay. That's a really good question, Caroline. So there were 2 different Ball State University teams that went out in 1965 and in 1975 that were orchestrated by Ben Schwartz when he was at Ball State as director of the archaeology management survey team, and they had recorded Mound 17 in 1975, and then the other way around. They recorded that one in 65. It was owned by Ralph Harvey, and it was part of his farmstead. And then they also recorded Site 74 in 1975, and that was recorded by the homeowner Ethel Moore at the time. So we pretty much went off of that. Almost all of the records are either with the Applied Anthropology Laboratory in our labs, or DHPA also has records of all of the original site cards and site maps and things like that. So we referred to both of those, and then also we looked at the updated topographic maps and some LiDAR images to really figure out the elevation of the mounds.
So,
and they didn't. Sorry, I just want to add something real quick. And they didn't. They were doing other large surveys in Henry County, but they didn't actually survey those 2 sites. They were reported to them, which is one of the reasons that we see both of them are actually. It's very confusing because the original descriptions of them, there's textual descriptions of where these sites are located, and then they have these sketch maps or drawing a huge circle on a topographic map, and they don't match. And so that's one of the reasons that we decided in talking with the DHPA staff, with Rachel especially, that because of that ambiguity in the original reports, that we can't say that it doesn't exist. It's not here. And so like HN 74, there are 4 different mapped or described locations, and then another one that's possibly different from one of the other ones. And so it's 4 to 5 different descriptions given by different people at different times, with a very confusing history of how they came to each of those different locations.
Thank you, Kevin.
Also, it looks like we do have a question in the chat from Mark about if any of the areas containing artifacts are in the same area the county will be building a new jail. It's just south of the current correctional facility.
I don't know where they're building it, but I don't think that they're building them within the state park or the wildlife area. to my knowledge, that would be a rather difficult thing to pull off. Maybe our DHPA folks can answer that question if they're doing reviews for that right now. Maybe they can't.
That's not my
I have
area
not
of,
seen anything, but
yeah.
yeah, I haven't seen anything. State parks is kind of their own animal, so we'd have to defer to the Division of State Parks and Reservoirs. But I'm not familiar enough with that property to say one way or another.
But would that would it require 106 review though? Yes.
It at least would require state review. It would be 106 if there's any federal funding or licensing.
I think it would require a C of A. I don't know if
Is
you
that
guys
how-
can hear me or not.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hear you.
Oh, okay. It might require a C of A, but yeah, I'm not sure if there's been any discussion of that. My question, and I always come into this from a historical perspective. So I don't know if this is information that in review of the historical documents and, you know, research that you did, but I'm always curious when you find historic artifacts, if there's any information about why the sites were abandoned. What, you know, what was there any information that you found in your research about why these areas were no longer habitated? Is that the right word?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I think so. One of the things that, first off, I'll just say, you know, flat out, we can't confirm any reason why these structures were abandoned and these properties were abandoned. But one thing that we did find is that at Summit Lake, there is kind of like a small village that was occupied in the 19th century called Rogersville, Indiana. And they had hoped to be the midway point between Newcastle and Muncie. But once the highways were constructed and the railroad was constructed, they totally bypassed Rogersville, and the town kind of was disbanded in the late 1800s. So it's possible that people kind of moved and disbanded around the time when that went out. But then it's also possible that people moved to Muncie during the gas boom. And so it's possible that people just were seeking opportunity once things kind of were lost in between Muncie and Newcastle. So it's kind of a guess that we have right now. Kevin, do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, it's just so as that apparently, according to the historical documents, there was already slightly on the decline in that area. The Rogersville village was on the decline, but then you have the gas boom, and it's affecting the broader region economically. And so those early sites, either associated with the original growth of Rogersville, or possibly with the initial development locally for the gas boom, but then they kind of fizzle back out, and so that large cluster of 4 or 5 houses right next to each other goes away in the early 20th century. And then ultimately why at least that big cluster is abandoned is because that's when the reservoir comes in. And so the conservation district purchases all that land, and there was still just one house in the 60s that was still there in the plat books as private property and not part of the conservation district. But then by the 80s, it was all conservation district and no more private property there. In the other survey area, though, it was always that one house, and that house is still there. That hasn't changed very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to come back to Mark's question and kind of to supply some context, because there was a bunch of regulation nerds talking about regulations in short terms. And so the reason I went back to this slide here is because I wanted to point out that Indiana does have state level archaeology historic preservation laws. Not all states have, and I'm originally from Ohio. Ohio doesn't have the same kind of state laws that protect our historical resources, and so if they're using state funds and certain state programs, have to go through review with the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology to get approval for their project. But if there's federal funds involved, and maybe we should have add a slide for that in the future. The National Historic Preservation Act, if there's any federal funds or federal permits involved, it goes through what's called the Section 106 process, and the DHPA is involved, but then there's also a federal agency. And so that's where we do a lot of the work that we do in the lab, and a lot of archaeologists do. And why I guess Rachel is in the office today, reviewing reports that are making sure that these development projects are complying with these state and federal laws. And Rachel's working hard, risking her health and safety going into the office to help us protect these historic sites. And so if there was something with the jail that did have federal funds involved, yeah, it would go through a review, and they would have to do a survey to look at what was there before they did any ground disturbing, and they'd have to get.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Any other questions or?
I have a question.
Okay.
Where will y'all be? Like, have y'all decided where you'll be next year for Historic Preservation Fund?
We haven't even decided which areas we're going to propose. So let's have to get through today in order to start to look at what the next applications that we're going to put in for. So maybe I'll think about it if I get to bed tonight. I don't know.
Well, we do have a couple projects that Ball State will be doing. One of them coming up this summer. They haven't been officially awarded yet. We're still waiting for the National Park Service to approve the state's application. But Ball State does have a tentative project to begin this summer that will be doing archaeology survey in the Morgan Monroe State Forest. So I know that's kind of on the immediate agenda, but again, that's still pending approvals.
Well, I didn't know we were allowed to say that publicly, so I didn't want to say it.
Well, you know, I'm just gonna let the cat out of the bag. Breaking, yeah. I mean, it is tentative. It's on the agenda, and we anticipate being able to fund it. And we're just, you know, obviously everything's a little wonky with, you know, with remote working and whatnot. But our application to the National Park Service for those funds was actually due also today. But I think we submitted that last week sometime. And so we're just, you know, waiting to hear. And then once we have that official approval, we'll be sending out all the official paperwork. But we'd have no anticipation that any of that's going to change. And so I feel confident that we're saying, yes, tentatively, we're going ahead with that.
Well, thank you for saying that, Malia. We for this summer, hopefully, we'll be going out to Morgan Monroe State Forest, and that one is looking at two CCC camps in the forest. So that'll be an interesting project. And now watch, we'll go there for historic stuff and just find all the pre-contact stuff.
Don't have too much fun.
All right, any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Well, Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for the good questions. We'll get this posted and within a week, hopefully, and you can watch it over again and do a greatest hits show.
Right.
All right.
Thanks for all your
Thanks,
hard
everybody.
work.
All right, have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.